Welcome back to the training on the MVA 70-534. And in this module, we're going to be talking about security and securing resources in Azure. So in this module, I mentioned we're going to be talking about security and centering mostly around security type topics. And so we have four major points that we're going to talk about today. The first will be managed identities. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means. What does managed mean as it terms to or applies to even our second point, which is hybrid identities. So kind of compare and contrast what happens there and why we have these terms. It's important for you to understand what these are for the exam. These are in the outline, and you should understand in detail what these things are when you're taking this type of exam. And to point on that too, this course is really around preparing you for the exam 534, but it's also it's going to be a lot to take on. So we're going to go through the high points of what's involved here, but it's really going to come back to you taking the initiative to go out and look at some of these things as well and get some experience with them. So we're kind of trying to seed you with that. And then also we'll talk about identity providers and how those work. So if we're interfacing with third parties, Google, Facebook, these types of things. How does that work, and how can we make that work with our cloud solution in Azure? And then we'll wrap up with a topic about data security solution models. Sounds a little bit general and broad, but it covers a couple different areas, so we'll talk about that.
Great.
So in the first module, we'll talk about managed identities. And to start off the discussion, we want to talk about Active Directory. So I have in this slide two different flows here. So if you look at the top of the slide, we see our cloud solution that we have that's using Azure. And then if you look at the bottom area of this slide, you can see the on-premises counterpart to that. So Ryan, when you look at this slide, you're probably saying this thing looks almost the same.
I mean, they look like they're entirely identical. It looks like they're offering the entirely the same services. How are they different?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a good point, right? Because when you start talking about Azure Active Directory versus on-premises Active Directory, there's some key differences. Judging from the slide, it looks like we have a counterpart for Exchange and SharePoint, and we have some sort of search here. It looks like it's a slightly different, this Graph API. And then we have this application model. So to talk through it a little bit, Azure Active Directory, so Active Directory on premises, when we talk about that, everybody's pretty familiar with that. If you've been doing infrastructure type work, or even if you're a developer who interface from an identity point, you're familiar with it being an LDAP directory source. It's a standards-based approach. And really it's about storing these objects that are important for our network, whether it's computers or users or services that are inside of our organization. We could do standard LDAP queries. And that works really well, so we can integrate that. We have frameworks like WIF that's built on top of this to be able to integrate, if you're using our .NET stack, into Active Directory. But if you look at the cloud, which is on the high part of the slide, we have the online version of these. So we have Exchange Online and SharePoint Online, part of our O365 product. And then we have Graph API. Now, one of the key distinctions here is that Azure Active Directory is not an LDAP source, per se. So we can't fire up LDP or any of the tools that we've used in the past and just do a query against this. So this is one of the key differences between this. So when we're using Graph API, we actually have a model similar to like a web service, maybe if you will, an OData web service that you can query to do that. And we'll talk about that in detail in a couple slides. We also have an app model that's slightly different. So when we bring applications to the cloud, there are certain considerations we need to think about when we're doing that. But one of the core differences to think about is we can't store computer objects up here. So if we had a customer come along and say, well, this sounds great that I can run my Active Directory in the cloud. I don't need to manage that infrastructure anymore. Not necessarily true, right? Because it works great for the user identity side of the model and some of our device models, but it doesn't work to manage your network resources like we did with on-premises Active Directory. And so if we step into Graph API, I mentioned just a bit ago that this is a way for us to interface with this Azure Active Directory and be able to search and query and read, update, delete, these type of operations. This is our primary interface in order to get into there. And so I mentioned that it was based on OData. So OData is a standard for interfacing with a REST type interface through a web service. So OData is the standard that we're using for Graph API. So if you understand OData, you're going to be in good shape here.
Great.
So we also mentioned that it does our CRUD type operations. And when I say CRUD, I don't mean dirty. I mean create, read, update, and delete. So in that model, we're essentially saying this is the interface, and it's going to allow you to do these different type of operations on your resources. And then we also talk about Graph Explorer. So Graph Explorer is a tool that's actually hosted in Azure by Microsoft. And really that tool's there to help developers and help people get up to speed with Graph API. So if you're not familiar with interfacing with OData or those types of services, this is a great tool for your developers to be looking at. And so it's important to understand that this tool set exists because it's a key to getting started with Graph API.
Sure. So I think you might have hit on it a little bit already, Cale, but for somebody used to working on-premise with Active Directory, what considerations do they have to make when working with Graph API?
Yeah, it's a great question. So like I mentioned, the tool set is going to be totally different for you. If you're familiar and you're a customer, you're a developer type, and you like working with web services, it's probably going to feel at home to you.
Right.
If you're an infrastructure type person who has relied on other tools in the past, it might be a little bit of a bump in the road for you because you're going to see a little bit of a difference there, but it's important to understand that key difference.
Great, good to know.
To continue on here with our discussion of Graph API, we also have the versioning I mentioned on this slide. This is key. So as we release new versions of this product, it's important because if it's on premises, you have total control over when we're going to upgrade Active Directory. So in the past, when you had Active Directory at, let's say, the 2008 support level, and then you moved it to 2012, so you had control of that. When you move to the cloud-based model, you're giving up that control for the flexibility. So now you don't have the infrastructure there to manage, but we have to be able to update it, right? So as Microsoft, there's going to be updates that come along to Graph API as the product matures. And it's key to understand that the API version is a part of that. So we have to make sure that we pass the API version when we're making these calls so that we can rely on these things and make sure that our applications don't break. So two other features about Graph API would be filtering and paging. And so on the filtering and paging side, really that's around OData, right? So it uses the industry standard models for that. And we'll show you some URLs here in a couple slides here that will walk you through that. It's based on REST standards. So Ryan, do you understand? Have you heard of REST before?
I have to say I have.
So in the REST-based model, this is a standard. So we came from a SOAP-based model of web services. Now we have a REST-based model, and the REST is really how the web works, right? So it's representational state transform, right? So when we talk about REST, we're talking about resources. So if we want to modify a user, we give the name of the user and a state that we want to change it to. If it's a group or any type of asset, that's really what REST encompasses. And then the extensions part is really important because it's important to understand that Graph API doesn't have a schema that's locked in stone. So just like the on-premises Active Directory, we could modify the schema. Maybe we create a custom line of business application that needs to take advantage of that. And that's key to understanding for the exam and even in the real world when we're working with this, to be able to know how much flexibility we have there with our custom solutions.
So are there any limitations with those schemas that you're talking about?
Yeah, and I have a slide here in a bit that talks about our schema extensions in detail, okay. and we'll talk about that. But yeah, there is some limitations you need to consider when you're looking at those kind of things. Just like on-prem, when you want to do a schema extension, it's important to understand what you're getting into.
Right. Absolutely. Great.
And so from a high level, when we talk about Graph API, we're talking about these objects that we're going to pass back and forth I mentioned just a minute ago. And this is what it breaks down into. And really the key point I want you to take away from this is understanding this term. When you see CSDL, what that actually means. And really it's around the schema definition that we have for these objects. So in this case, if you look at this, you can see that we have an entity here that's called a user, and it has some attributes about it. Does that look pretty familiar?
It looks just like Active Directory to me.
Right, so that's the idea, right? So we have an object here, and instead of it being an LDAP, we now have a schema here that's being used up there in Graph API. So these are some of the same attributes that you would see in the on-premise version of Active Directory. And so it's not important for you to understand, all the really super low-level details about this, but really I wanted to kind of see that this is the entities and these are the objects that we're going to be passing back and forth. And I threw a URL in here that we'll talk about in detail here about the versioning in a minute. And so working with Graph, so we mentioned that this is based on a web service model, and there's kind of a schema for the URIs that we're going to pass. And so when we're talking about resource objects, like I said before, we're talking about this users. If you look at this slide here, where we have the tenant name, so we have contoso.com, and then we also have the user. So we want to deal with users. And in this case, we're working with a specific user named Adam. And so you can see it's really easy to understand like what we're trying to query just looking at the URI here. There's nothing encoding binary or any custom formats or anything here. This is all standards based.
It's very readable. It's very clean.
Yeah, and that's a great thing about it, so it's easy to interface with. And then we also have the API version that we pass here to tell Graph that when we want to interface with this user object, we want to use this version of your API.
Great.
And so this is another breakdown by that, and I mentioned some of these details already about the tenant and what object we're using, but this one adds another component, if you look here at the end, and this comes back to OData. So when we talked about this system is based on OData, one of the features of OData is being able to do these queries or these filters or these order bys. So there's a bunch of keywords that are already encoded into OData. So it's important to understand that you don't have to create anything here in order to do that. It's out of the box for you, and that's part of OData. So if you hear somebody mentioning some of these keywords, you understand it's part of OData. And in the next slide, I wanted to talk about another topic that kind of goes hand in hand with what we're doing when we're interfacing with Graph is a differential query. So probably saying to yourself, Ryan, what do you think of when you hear the word differential query?
Well, I sort of assume that it's taking the difference in some change, and it's only applying a difference. It's not looking at the whole thing when it's querying.
Sure. And so that comes back, and you'll see why this is important when we talk about synchronization in a bit. But the importance of differential queries is understanding the changes that happen in our directory. So again, I'll draw the correlation to what happens on-premise. We had Active Directory. We could do queries into LDAP and store a token to say that when we come back, we've already retrieved these records. We just want the changes when we come back. And we got this little key that we can use to tell us, yeah, we only want to get those things. And so LDAP would understand that. Graph has something similar. So you'll see here in the next slide, if we move to it, it's called Delta Link. So in the Delta Link, and I have a URI format for this in a minute, but we'll walk through the workflow. Essentially, the client's going to come in and query, just like you saw those URIs I had before. And let's say we queried all the Active Directory users in Azure Active Directory. So if we do that and we pass an empty Delta Link, we're telling Graph API, hey, I want to make this query and get this data, but I want you to also give me back a token, because when I come back later, I don't want to retrieve all these again. I only want to retrieve the changes. And so that's, to break this down, that's really how simple it is. And Graph will respect that Delta Link. So if you look at this slide, we again have our URI breakdown. We're talking about our tenant and directory object, and then we see this Delta Link, which is empty. And again, I mentioned the reason. So when we pass empty, we're telling Graph, fill this in for me when you give me the response. And so here's a kind of a cut through, and this is some JSON syntax that basically how we get data from OData. So when we retrieve this back, part of it is we get this array here that's called value. Inside this value, we get whatever we queried. So in our case, we were talking about users. We wanted to query users. And so when we queried the users, we got back this object ID. But we also got back this Delta Link. So you can see here it's been truncated. It's very long. But that's the piece that you would store in your application so that when you come back, you wouldn't have to retrieve everything. One other point to mention again with the schema extensions. So we have ability to add custom attributes and extensions to Active Directory. And these are available since the 1.2 preview, but there are some limitations around this. So Ryan mentioned this, and it's important to understand these. There's a maximum limit, and this is kind of the big one that I hear people talk about a lot, is the 256 characters. So make sure you understand that when you are extending these things, that they can't be super large values that you want to store out there. And there's reasons behind that for querying performance and that thing. For the exam, these are things that are important to understand because these are some of the limitations of the system. Then I broke it down and gave you some URIs here. So even if you don't go through them here while we're going through them now, you can come back and look at this, use it as a reference point, and these will give you some examples of how when we query using GraphNet or Graph API, how we can get things like group membership and a user's manager, and just give you some examples to get started.
Well, that all seems very powerful, and it seems like a fantastic way to handle all of this in the context of Azure and in the context of the cloud.
Yeah, it works really well. And so the next thing I wanted to do is just give you a real quick demo on the Graph Explorer. So if we jump out to a web browser here, and you'll see that I navigated to a particular site here. Oops. And you see I'm going to this, You'll see I'm going to this URL, graph.windows.net. And the URI I'm going to is graphexplorer.cloudapp.net. So this is hosted on Azure. You can come in here and use this as a test bed to test some queries out, right? So we have a documentation link that will link you over to help things, and we have a way for you to sign into your Azure Active Directory tenant. So if you have one already provisioned, you can come in here and sign in and test directly against your stuff. But in my model here, or the demo I'm going to show here, I'm just going to use this demo company, and you see when I click on that, it put a tenant ID in here. This is what's, when we saw our URIs before, we saw the tenant ID. And if I just do a get on that, so I'm making this web call into Azure to say, give me for this tenant, give me back what you have about this tenant. So this is tenant level information. You can see we can get tenant details, we can get subscriptions, permissions, users, apps, all really cool stuff. So let's say in case we just wanted to get a list of users. So what users exist out there for this directory? And again, you can see the JSON syntax that we get back. Similar format like we saw before with Active Directory. So we're getting back like all these attributes that we're used to seeing with users.
Great. So Kel, I have to interject really quickly. Who might this tool be very useful for? Who might be using this Graph Explorer tool?
Yeah, great question. So again, I mentioned that this is great, especially for developers who are getting up to speed with Graph API. So as they're just getting comfortable with this, understanding the syntax, understanding what responses they're going to get back, that's part of the challenge when we start integrating applications. And so this is a great tool for developers to come in and check it out. I'm not saying that it can be used by others as well,
Sure.
So anybody that's in your Active Directory tenant could also use this tool, but yeah, really good for developers.
Great.
And so we'll jump back over to the slides. And we'll move into a different area. Now we're going to talk a little bit about OAuth and OpenID. So these are security models. These are standards that are used for authentication and authorization. These are industry standards. These are not a Microsoft specific thing. So I have here that they're based on open standards, OAuth 2 being the standard that we're employing right now. So we're going to talk about a couple different things in this, this little subsection here, and one of them is ADL. And so ADL stands for the Active Directory Authentication Library. Now this is a Microsoft specific tool that's been built to help you interface with these things easier. So if you're writing .NET code, very easy to go pull this from NuGet and integrate this into your project. And then we're going to talk about authorization code flow. So from a high level, if we start with OAuth 2.0, we can look really quickly at kind of what are the feature sets between these two. And I bring this up, we don't need to go into detail about each one of these, but I really wanted to get you the sense that Azure actually has some pretty broad support for OAuth here, as opposed to even our on-premise version of ADFS. And so really, I don't want to dwell in the details too much there. I just wanted you to understand, and this is important to understand for the exam, where OAuth voids are filled by Azure Active Directory versus on-premises. And so if we walk through an OAuth 2.0 client credential flow, so let's walk through a little bit of how this works,
Sure.
or what we're talking about with OAuth. So if we have an end user over here that wants to access a web application that works with Graph. So one of the things they're going to do when they access that application is going to be aware and say, I need, you want to access Graph, but we need something to authenticate you to know that you're safe to be accessing it. So we're going to send that access token request up to the Azure AD OAuth endpoint, right? So the OAuth endpoint is then going to return to us an access token, which we'll then pass along with our call to Graph. Now you weren't seeing that in the when we were doing the Graph Explorer demo, but that's actually happening in the background. So you need to understand that not everybody can just come in and query your directory service. You have to authenticate first, and this is the model we've chosen to do that.
Great.
I have one slide thrown in here because this is an area that will be you should understand if you're discussing Azure architectures, and as well as on the exam, is understanding what a JWT is. Have you heard of a JWT, Ryan?
Well, I've worked with JSON, but I can't say I've actually explored the anatomy of a JWT. How exactly does it work with JSON?
Okay, so Ryan just mentioned a couple points there. I just want to draw a similarity here, but JSON, when we talk about JSON,
Sure.
This is a syntax that we use to transfer data, right? So if we're talking about a SOAP-based thing, in the past we often use XML. When we're using XML, the format can get pretty big because we have all these tags that we have to carry around. JSON is a much leaner format, so you'll see the curly braces and you'll see the array syntax that it passes back and forth. Very simple syntax, and this is used for when you hear things called a JWT, that's a JSON Web Token. So we're saying that we have our token information that we're going to pass around to these applications to let us know that we're authenticated, and we're going to use a JSON format inside of there. Again, we don't have to go, you can delve really deep into understanding JWTs and the difference between the other token formats that we have, but it's just important to understand that what a JSON Web Token is. Taking a step back into one of the bullet points I had earlier was the ADL, right, when we had it on that slide, and that was the Active Directory Authentication Library. And so when we talk about that, this is kind of a flow, if you were, about how that actually works. So in this case, this works with Active Directory, the Federation services, which is our on-prem version of Federation. It also works with Azure Active Directory. And so in this model, we have some resource over here, if you look at this diagram on the right side, that actually trusts this authority that's going to dole out tokens for us, right? So when the client comes in and hits this thing, he's going to have to register himself and get a token, and then every time I want to call this resource, I'm going to use that token. To break it down to the simplest terms, this is the data flow for interfacing using Active Directory Authentication Library. And then if we hit the last point, it's about authorization code flow. So this is a much more detailed involvement. You saw that simple model I just showed you, how we get tokens and pass those so that the application knows that we're somebody that should be accessing the application. But in this model, we have John on our slide here, and he clicks a button that says he wants to buy something, right? So he's on a website, he wants to buy something. And so when he clicks on that, the client itself, the application, is aware that this thing authenticates using OAuth. So he's going to redirect John over to the OAuth server. It's going to say, no, you need to go over to this other site, and you need to prove who you are. And when you come back here, then tell me who you are based on what he told you, and I'll let you in based on that. And so when we see, then John says, okay, so he talks to the OAuth server, and the OAuth server is going to authenticate John. So in many ways, when people see, like, you sign into applications on the internet, and maybe it redirects to Facebook, and you're like, what the heck's going on? I'm not on Facebook. But if you chose to log in via Facebook, what's happening here is it's doing the same thing, right? It's redirecting you over there, asking you for credentials, and once you have those, it's going to go ahead and grant you access for the application. And you'll see that there's a consent token, an authorization code that gets sent back to the application saying, you know, John's who he says he is. I trust who John is. The client, you know, requests the access token, and you'll see this right here. So now what's happening here is the application is going over and talking to that server. So John, you know, this token came back through John that said, yeah, I'm okay to be in here. But we're like, yeah, well, let's go talk to your boss over here and make sure that it's okay. And so in this model, the boss would be the OAuth server. And so in this case, it was a Facebook OAuth server. And we pass our authorization token there. And he's going to generate an access token. And now we can get into the application in this case.
Great. So I see this use case for OAuth. You were also talking about OpenID before. How do OAuth and, you know, how are OAuth and OpenID different, and how might you use OpenID?
Yeah, it's a great point. So I actually have two slides, so I can just hold that for 1 second because I have one more slide on authorization code flow just to show you this workflow again.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. And so in this model, I kind of went through it, but we basically have an application, and we're going to send this code over through /authorize. And in this case, we're actually using Azure AD. So the difference between the Facebook API and Azure AD is what I was trying to show here. And so you can see in this slide that we actually have authorize up here in the URI when we send it through. The user is going to be authenticated, and this code, just like we did with Facebook, you know, the code is going to come back to the application. We're going to send that token request back to the OAuth server. He's going to generate a token. So we're doing the same thing, right? We're getting a code, and we're getting a token based on that code, and using that to access the application.
Great.
So here's the OpenID version of that. So you were talking about that earlier, Ryan. And in this model, you can see that the application is talking to an OAuth or an OpenID provider. Right, so these are out there. They can be on the internet. People can host these outside of whatever. You know, it's not a Microsoft-specific thing, right? So we have these OpenID servers based on standards. The application has been set up to trust that, and so when the guy comes in and accesses the application, he's going to browse to the web. That's going to initiate this login procedure, and based on that, it's going to redirect him over to this OpenID server. The OpenID and some of this I broke down. I showed you some of the JSON here, so you can go through that at your leisure.
Sure.
And what I was showing was that once there's an authentication and a consent, it's going to build the authorization code the same way we did with CodeFlow, and it's going to come back through, send it back to the application. It's going to check with the OpenID provider again, so we're doing that check to make sure that somebody's not playing games with us and giving us a token or a authorization code that's not valid.
Right.
And we also have the JSON syntax there. He's going to pass the token back to the application. You can see it there in the header. We have access token right here. It's a bearer type token. Again, you should spend some time dealing with these tokens and understanding the difference between what's a bearer type token and what are some of the differences, other different types of tokens, because those are important for the exam as well as in the real world.
Great, so we're just skimming the surface here.
Yeah, just trying to seed, to get you aware that there is these things called OpenID and OAuth and these different types of protocols out there that you need to understand and understand the differences between the two. And so we move on to one other topic on SAML here, and this is around single sign-on, so a web single sign-on. So these diagrams look very similar, but there's actually a little bit different things that are happening here. So in this case, we have an application that trusts a SAML issuer. And so in this case, the browser, he browses to it, it bounces it back to the user and says you need to go talk to the SAML provider. Again, there's going to be an authentication that's happening with that SAML, and once we get the SAML request back, we're going to take that token that it gave us and post it directly to the application. So in this case, you saw there's a little bit difference, right? We didn't have the authorization code. Like we didn't have a code and then a token and then checking it. So this was a little bit leaner type profile. And also I wanted to mention that when you're talking about SAML, there's different modules inside of SAML. So we're showcasing some of the profiles here. So we're showcasing WebSSO, and I'll show you one other profile, but there's other modules inside SAML that you really need to delve into and understand how they work. So this would be the second type of, the contrast kind of to WebSSO profile, and this is the passive requester profile. Looks very similar. I have the flow over here on the right side. You can see that it's not compatible if something is saying it's supporting WebSSO as the profile. So these standards that are over here, like the WebSSO and the passive requester, these are the types of protocol things you need to understand, the details you need to understand when you're setting these applications up, because they're, in many cases, not compatible. In this case, they're definitely not compatible. And so in this case, it's a little bit different request and response flow, right? We do an access to a resource, we get the authentication back, and then we're requesting into the guy who's going to generate the tokens. We're going to go ahead and authenticate with him. He's going to issue the authentication, and then we're going to go authenticate, into the application. Slightly different flow, and you can see there's a difference between who's creating the token request. So it's important to understand that difference.
So all these different forms of authorization have very similar flows. Why might I choose one over another?
Great question. So it really comes back to security, right? So do we need to have multiple levels of security in order to check it, right? Do we have to have the callback to a server from our server application to make sure that token came through in the case of authorization code? Versus maybe we don't, maybe the token model works for us. And there's also things like expiration that you have to consider with tokens, so we don't want to leave them laying around for a long time because people could use them for replay type attacks where they would use the token over again.
Right.
So it really comes down to understanding what are the requirements for your application or the customer's application.
Right.
From a security perspective, how far do we have to go with it, right? Also comes back to what infrastructure you have involved, who's going to be the identity provider,
Absolutely.
Those types of things as well.
So these tools aren't just being redundant, they actually have different use cases that they perform better or worse in.
Yep.
Great.
Yeah, perfect. So we'll move into the next section. It's on hybrid identities. So with the hybrid identities, really what we're talking about is this model of, and I'm showing a slide here about synchronization, but there's two different types of models that we follow when we're doing identity-based work, right? So
Sure.
We're either doing a synchronization type approach or we're doing a federation type approach. So when we're doing synchronization, that means, obviously there's something that's being copied, right? So we're going to synchronize or copy these things to different sources. That model works for certain use cases. We'll walk through what those are. Federation is a little bit more like, I don't want to handle this, I don't know how to handle this, but this guy over here does and I trust him. So use him to go through when you're doing federation. So that's kind of the difference between the two. And you can actually mix them when we're talking about things like directory synchronization that we're going to touch on here. And so in this model, when you look at this slide, we have our synchronization architecture for some of our Azure type work. And we see that on our on-prem over here, we have our Active Directory service. We have an identity manager, maybe in this case, we have HR. We have a bunch of applications we're using on-premise here. So there's like a bridge that gets built here, this identity bridge. And what the connector that we use here, we can either use Directory Sync, this thing called Azure Active Directory Sync, which is the new, kind of a newer version of DirSync. And then we can also use FIM. Have you heard of FIM before, Ryan?
I can't say I have.
So great. So FIM is one of our identity products that we use. Typically it's used with larger enterprises, but it can be used with any. And really what it does is allow you to really tweak the knobs and dials with how you want synchronization to work, right? So these are synchronization technologies. So if I want to replicate maybe my user objects to a different kind of source, maybe like a different directory service, maybe it could be Azure, maybe it could be something else.
Sure.
But I only want to synchronize these 5 attributes or something like that. FIM really allows you to dial that in a lot. We can do some customization with DirSync, but FIM is really, when you think about FIM, think about this is like the one that's the very large superset of features that we can turn on. So use it if you need to really control that synchronization. DirSync is a very good tool to get on board fast. So then we also, in this model, we're actually synchronizing up to the cloud, so Azure Active Directory. So if you look at the slide over here where it says Microsoft Cloud, this is where we would sync, and this symbol is here to identify Azure Active Directory. So in this model, it could be used and consumed by Exchange or Lync or SharePoint or even third-party applications. And then it can also tie out, and this is an important point, the SaaS applications over here. So the important distinction here is we have Active Directory, and then we have this service called ACS, which we'll touch on in a moment, which allows us to basically federate out to these things to say, hey, when someone logs into this, we're actually going to use Google to authenticate them. We're actually going to use Salesforce to authenticate them. So this is the interface that we would use to kind of mix the two, the synchronization and the federation.
Okay, great.
So at the core, if we look at our next slide, at the core of DirSync and even Azure Directory Sync at the core, we have a model here. We have on-premise and Azure. And in this case, I just kind of documented it. We have a user here, and he's got some attributes like given name, his SN, his last name, and mail. And we also want to sync those up to the cloud. So we run this product on-premise called DirSync. And the DirSync tool is going to watch for changes in Active Directory, and it's going to make sure that those changes get synchronized up to Azure. So this is a model where we have a tool that runs in the background that can actually do this at a predefined schedule. It's going to do that. So, where do you have you heard of this before, Ryan? Where do you think this would be useful?
I mean, it's certainly going to be useful in any application where you do want to sync your Active Directory into Azure. I do have a question regarding that, however. If you've got these multiple working models, why would you use one over the other?
No, it's a great question. So to touch on the first thing, when we are doing the synchronization, it's important to understand that these are going to just get the changes, right?
Sure.
So the key point there is if we set this up and then we add a new user to Active Directory on-premise tomorrow, he's automatically going to get added to the cloud if he meets the criteria that we defined in DirSync, right? If we say he's in this particular organizational unit, he's in this particular group, make sure that his stuff syncs up to Azure.
Right.
So that's a great way for admins, especially like small businesses even. They don't have to manage a lot of this stuff. They don't have to go create multiple accounts every time they do things. It also works on the flip side, deprovisioning. That's a big thing for auditors. We want to make sure that we clean up these directory sources when these people are gone. And part of this product, the FIM product or the DirSync product, is making sure that kind of thing happens in a timely fashion. But to your other point about the feature sets, as I mentioned, DirSync is really good, especially we see this a lot, when you're using Office 365
right.
initially, because it's one of the key things that you have to do to enable Office 365, because we need our objects up there, right? We need our mailboxes to be created. And so that's a key for that. But the FIM product is, again, if we have much more disparate systems, so if we have a back-end HR system that's running different technology, or we want to synchronize maybe to different data sources like directory services, like eDirectory, for instance, that allows and enables those kind of things. Can't do a lot of that customization with DirSync.
Sure. Great.
And so there's a couple different things that happen with DirSync. So we have the core DirSync, which we've been talking about. So we synchronize objects. We also can do password sync with it. And then we can do this SSO, which is kind of this hybrid, back to the hybrid identities thing. But we can actually do a synchronization, but then do federation. And we'll show that here in a demo. Or not a demo, but we'll show a slide here to walk through that process. I'm going to show 2 different slides here about how applications could leverage these things based on whether the identity was in the cloud or on-prem. So in this model, we have a web application here on-prem that trusts Azure Active Directory. So we've set that up to begin with. Those two trust each other now. And in this case, we're able to use these protocols on the side. Again, back to these are great test questions, understanding which protocols are supported when your identities are in a cloud versus on-premise. And so I've noted those there. And if we look at the opposite, based on if we have an application, maybe we deployed the app to the cloud, but we want to keep our directory on premises. So in that case, we have a federation services that we use, and there's a trust built between our web application and our ADFS infrastructure. You can see the protocols are supported there, and you see there's not as much support as what we do with the cloud.
And both are well supported and work functionally well?
Yeah, both of these models work great. And I'll show you where they fit in the next slide, actually. So if we take a look at, okay, yeah, Kale, you said there's a lot of options here. There's a lot of things I can do. There's federation, there's synchronization. Well, which one? It was too confusing for me to understand like which one to do.
Well, and you also mentioned that you might very often use a solution that uses both, and I'm a bit confused about that and why you'd use synchronization if you're already using federation.
Yeah, that's a great question. So here's two models that I have laid out here. If you look at the top line here, we have a synchronization-based technology that we're using here. So we have Azure Active Directory on premises, and we have our DirSync server here in the middle, which is doing our identity sync, which is our objects, so our user objects in this case. And it's also going to do this password hash sync. And so what that's actually able to do, and it's an important distinction to understand, is when we sync objects, right? If we sync user objects, these are happening on a schedule, right? So we can run it every 30 minutes, every hour, every half a day. Depending on how many objects we have, we probably want to scale that based on that so that we don't bog down our network.
Right.
But the password hash actually is slightly different. In that model, it actually goes real time, right? Or as near real time as it can. Because it's important to understand that we're not storing those passwords somewhere where they can be hacked and those type of things. So we don't want to have that happen. So in this case, it's just in flight. So we're going to capture the password change that happened on premise and we're going to flush it to the cloud. And I'll talk about why that might be important, because we didn't have this feature to begin with when we first released our directory services product, but we have it now. And so then if you look at the bottom, this is one that's more based on federation. So in this model, we still have our identity sync that's happening. So our objects are being created up here.
Great.
You'll notice we don't have password sync turned on. Because in this model, we're actually provisioning our objects up there, but if somebody needs to use this directory source over here on the right side, if somebody has an application, or maybe it's O365, maybe it's your Exchange account, when those things are authenticating and using Azure Active Directory, we can configure that directory or that application up there to say, no, don't authenticate off what's up here in the cloud. Actually go back to this ADFS server and ask him. So in this model, we're actually provisioning the objects up there through one mechanism, and then we're authenticating a different way. So we're not authenticating local. This is a big point, right? Because when we talk about this in the past, we didn't have password sync, so we would have the situation where we could sync our objects up there, but maybe we didn't want to run an ADFS infrastructure. And
Sure.
so when we did that, it became kind of hard because it was like, well, you have to do ADFS in order to do authentication, or you have to recreate the object and manually sync the password up there, which was kind of cumbersome. Now we have password sync, so we can fill all those voids. And the last thing I want to touch on here in this module was ACS. So ACS is a model, it's an application framework that allows us to set up these trusts to different providers. So in this case, we have identity providers listed on the right side here, like Live, Yahoo, Facebook. And these can be anything that supports these different protocols. ADFS supports a certain protocol. We can use OpenID. But these guys are set up as identity providers. And so these guys will interface with what's called ACS, which is Access Control Service, through Windows Azure. So we can provision this, and I'll show you in a second where you do this in the portal quickly, but you can actually set up your application so that you say, yeah, I have this guy provisioned up in the cloud, but when you authenticate, go use this identity provider as opposed to using Azure Active Directory. Sure. And so with that, we'll pop out to ACS. And so I have the portal pulled up here. So if you log into your portal and you go under Active Directory node over here, you'll see that we have our directories over here, but we also have this thing called Access Control Namespaces. ACS, right? So it doesn't have the S here, it's namespaces, but it's a service. So I have one provisioned here, and you can create one. All you have to do is click New down here, and you could go through the process to go ahead and create a namespace. So if you hit Access Control, click Create, you can name it whatever you want, you can put it in a region. Once you do that, it takes a few seconds, it'll go create this Access Control Service, and when you click on that, you actually come to this page. So it's another service that's been set up for you, it's been provisioned as part of that. And this will walk through, if you actually looked in here at the identity providers, my session's timed out. So if you look at the identity providers, by default we have the Windows Live ID. Well, we can add other ones, right? So if we hit add here, we see there's Google, there's Yahoo, and there's also this kind of generic one here with this WS Federation. So in that model, we can support anything, outside there that supports that standard, right? ADFS 2.0 happened to be one of them. But we have pre-configured ones for Google, Yahoo, and Facebook inside of here. So it's important to understand where that is in the portal and that we have that functionality to be able to pull that off.
Yeah, it seems like a very powerful tool.
It's great. So in this last thing I want to touch is ADFS. So when we talk about ADFS, we've been talking about it a little bit here. What is ADFS? ADFS is a federation server, so it's not a synchronization.
Sure.
And it's a federation model where you're allowed to basically sub out the actual authentication duties or the authentication duties to another application tier, to another infrastructure. So it's a web-based single sign-on approach. It does federation, like I mentioned, so that it's going to handle those duties for you. We can interface with external users, so meaning people that may not be in your directory service.
Sure.
We can actually enable them to log in too. And you saw how we can do some of that stuff. We can use identity providers from different areas to pull that off. We have this thing called multi-factor auth.
Yeah, I hear about that all the time. Can you tell me more about that, Kale?
Yeah, so the multi-factor auth is exactly what it says. It's a multiple factor authentication, and what it means is when I go to log into a website per se,
Sure.
so we log in, we typically give a password. When we give that password, it checks to make sure that password is the correct one and we get logged in. But if we have multi-factor auth, it means multiple. So think about it from that perspective. It means we have to log in with that credential, and maybe something else has to happen in order for it to trust that we're the person we say we are.
So do you have multiple passwords, or are you somehow working with something else?
Yeah, so it's an open standard, but typically what happens is there's a device or something like that. I can talk through a couple of them. One of the big ones was RSA. In the past, we had these adapters where they would basically be counting a number every 30 seconds and changing. And so when those numbers would change, basically you would go to log into your application that supported multi-factor auth, you put your password in, and then you would also have to put this other code in that they knew you had this token, this little thing out here that was generating numbers. We have something similar with our actual phone app. We have an authenticator application that does something very similar to that.
So it'll deliver an actual code to you, and then using that, you basically have a redundant security system where you've got essentially a second password?
Yeah, it's not really redundant. It's more of another level of check.
Sure.
Right? So if you said, I pulled you over along the road, I need your driver's license for your car, but I also want to see your registration to make sure this is your car. You're trying to build a case to say, is this guy who he says he is, right? Same thing with an application. We're going to present our password. They're like, great, but you could have stole that password.
Right.
Does he have the phone that generates this code? Because if he does, then I have more level of trust that he's who he says he is.
So I imagine applications that are, that the number one priority is security would probably be more likely to use something like this than another solution.
Definitely. It's a great feature. Yeah. And there's also this BYOD, which is bring your own device. So this thing, the ADFS infrastructure supports this. So if people want to bring their own devices, whether they're comply with your corporate policy, that's a must, right? So we set these policies up, but the actual hardware, the device that they're using, doesn't necessarily have to be a specific model. So that's what BYOD is about. It allows password operations to do your password resets. Again, it's a REST infrastructure, and it allows extensions as well to support different models. I have just one slide on identity providers that we're going to talk through because we kind of touched on it already, but really I wanted to just hit a couple key points here about social identities, Facebook, Google, all these different ones we talked about, and why it's important. It's important for a couple different reasons. One is the integrated experience of being able to have someone pick how they want to be authenticated as opposed to you forcing them to create a new account. You create new accounts, now there's more passwords. Now there's more things for that user to remember, more things for them to lose, more chance for something to be attacked there, right? We're removing the surface area if we can slim that down some way. So that's the important point about that. We want to lower the friction for the sign-up experience, so when someone comes in, they don't have to go through a big process to create and allow them to integrate existing passwords. And the last module that we're going to talk about today, which again we'll touch on some of the objectives of the test, is the data security solution models. Sounds very technical, but it's actually just a couple different things that we want to talk about here. The first of which is access control lists.
Sure.
So anybody that's familiar with ACLs or access control lists from, let's say, firewall devices, 15 years ago we had devices that had ACLs on them. So why is this any different? Well, really what this is about is when we're provisioning stuff specific to Azure, we're able to lock these things down and provide these ACLs. And really what that's about is saying, I have this IP out here, and I have this provisioned service up here, and I want to make sure that only those two can talk. So in order to do that, by default, maybe you have it's exposed to the public. And even if it's exposed to the public, we can lock the address to say, no, only allow it coming from this specific address or this specific subnet. And really, that's the key importance to understanding these ACL, these access control lists. There's lots of documentation out there about how these are implemented in Azure, but you can put them on a lot of your different resources out there in Azure. So this is a great way to secure your resources. Back to the original topic of this discussion. And then we talk about another technology that we have called Azure RMS. So this is RMS stands for Rights Management Service. And so in this, you can see it's in the center here of this diagram, but really what this is about is, it's a type of DRM, if you would think about it that way. DRM being a way for us to secure our content, a way for us to secure something that we're going to send to somebody. So in this case, we do directory synchronization from on-prem into our cloud here in the middle that's running rights management. So in this case, maybe back down here in the lower right corner, you can see that we have Exchange services and SharePoint. So if any of you are familiar with our on-prem version of Exchange where we had IRM, it was called, so it was an information rights management for messages. So if I send an email to Ryan, but I don't want Ryan to be able to print it for some reason. So I said, no, this is for eyes only. I don't want you printing it. I can actually set an attribute inside of Exchange to say when this message gets sent, well, I want to use RMS. I want to use this IRM technology, this rights management service, so that when he receives it, it's going to have to make sure that Ryan is the guy that received it first off. And once Ryan receives it, it's going to check with the server and say what policies are governing this resource. So if it's you're not allowed to print or you're not allowed to forward it, that's a typical example with Exchange. We also have file services, so we can do the same thing with files. So we can lock files down and kind of provide this heavyweight enforcement. So if we have documents that are very sensitive, that we need to be using rights management and enforcing these types of things on, not just trusting people, this is the model that we'd use for that.
Great.
Again, tons of documentation out there on rights management, something you should know about. And the last thing that we're talking about is role-based access control. So in role-based access control, really quickly, this is a brand new service that's in Azure. It's really new. And really, when you think about RBAC or role-based access, it's really around the model of we have a resource and we need to secure access to that resource, but we don't necessarily want to secure it directly to a person, right? So Ryan is helping me at this business, and I want to give him access to a resource in Azure. Let's say a website.
Sure.
So in that model, I could create a role that says these are the website admins or these are the website developers. And then I could put Ryan in a group, and that group could be associated with that role. Now, when Ryan leaves, let's say Ryan's done with the project, he's off the project, we don't have to go in and manage that ACL really closely to say we got to remove Ryan because it's going to happen automatically, right? We removed him from the source, and RBAC is tied to the role. So we didn't change the role, we just changed the members of a group that are associated with the role. That's the key tenet around understanding what RBAC is.
Sounds like something we've done on Windows for a long time.
Yeah, definitely. And so the last demo that I have is a brief showcase of this. So we'll come up to our new portal. And we'll log in. And I'm showing it in the new portal because it doesn't exist in the old portal. This is cutting edge stuff. This is brand new that we're just putting out there. And in fact, there's not a tremendous amount of objects that support it up there yet. But I'll show you one of them.
Great.
Step into our portal. We'll pick our directory. Again, an Azure Active Directory. And we'll come under here under this this browse, which gives us access to all the different things that we have deployed up there. But if we go under the Everything node, we can see all the different things that we can provision on Azure. Let's actually just go under subscription because there's support for that right now. And I can go under, this is my MSDN subscription. And we can see my subscription here and all the details, but we see this other section on access. So here we can see these roles. So we were talking about role-based access. Here's our roles, and here's our users. So if we clicked on the roles, we can actually see that we have different roles that are set up here. We have owners, and right now the subscription admin has inherited access to this, and I could actually go ahead and add another user. So in this case, if I wanted to add Ryan as a user, I would add him to my portal. I could grab his name, I could go ahead and do an invite and add him to that list. And then he would have access to do the same thing that an owner has. Now, there's not, like I said, there's a way to do this with PowerShell right now too, but we're adding features every day, and the features that are going to be added here will allow you to create new roles in the future. And so there's not a lot of support there right now, but we just have these sections right here. So when you see these under the resources in Azure, these are where you would control RBAC. And so to wrap it up, that's kind of our discussion today. I hope that I've kind of touched on some things and kind of helped your mind understand, the areas that you need to be into in order to, first off, ace this exam. We want to ace the exam and become certified as an Azure architect.
Absolutely.
But we also want to understand the architecture of Azure so that when we're developing solutions, we're doing it right.
Great. Thanks, Gail.
Yep. So stay tuned for our next module. We'll be back on module 6 in a little bit, but there's going to be another one in between. So thank you.
Thanks.